The macabre history of the Farthingtons. They owned no mirrors after 1901. What if a family could erase its sins by erasing its own reflection? In the year 1901, the Farthingtons of Wratham Hall gave an order that unsettled even the most obedient servants. Every mirror, every polished glass, every surface that might return a face was to be removed and taken away before sundown. At first it was spoken of as an act of mercy, a gesture meant to protect a fragile woman from the shock of her own grief. Neighbors were told that tragedy had struck within the household, that a young ward of the family, Clara, had gone missing near the river and likely drowned, and that the lady of the house had fallen ill with despair. Outwardly, it was the kind of genteel sorrow the countryside knew how to excuse. Flowers were sent, prayers were offered, and respectable people murmured that grief can twist a household into strange shapes. Yet something darker lurked beneath this sudden fear of reflections, something that made even the servants pause as they carried heavy frames down the winding staircases and felt the breath of the house pressing close against their shoulders. The disappearance of Clara was written in the papers as a brief notice, clean and polite, as if a life could be reduced to a single line between dates. She was 16, an orphan placed under the guardianship of the family, a girl remembered for her pale hands and the way she laughed in the gardens. They said she slipped on the stones by the water and was lost to the current. Men dragged the river with hooks, but their nets found only weeds and mud. The family offered money for a new bridge, and the vicar held a blessing at the banks, and soon the official story ended. But stories that are forced to end often continue in whispers. A stable boy claimed he saw her pale figure framed in an upstairs window the night after the memorial, though the glass had already been taken from that room. He swore there was another face behind hers, not steady like a person's, but trembling like a reflection on water. He told no one again. Silence was the price of bread in that house, and everyone understood the cost of asking questions that scraped too close to the truth. As the days passed, the house began to alter itself. Portraits were draped in cloth until the faces suffocated under dust. Silver was left to tarnish on purpose. Even the lake was sometimes covered with lily pads spread by careful hands at dawn, a false skin laid across the water to deny it the power to reflect. Guests who visited found the rooms unsettling, not for what was there, but for what was missing. They said it felt as though invisible eyes watched from the blank spaces where mirrors once hung, as though the house itself had developed a memory too sharp to ignore. Servants moved without looking into polished wood or shining banisters, afraid of the accidental glimpse that might return something that should not be seen. Children were told that shadows kept secrets better than glass, and soon even their games avoided surfaces that might bounce back their laughter. The house grew dim, not from lack of lamps, but from the absence of reflected light. In the village, people spoke softly when the Farthingtons were mentioned. They repeated that wealth had made the family strange, and strangeness could be forgiven when explained as grief. Yet the silence was uneasy. People remembered a maid who never returned from her holiday, a tradesman's son who left his bicycle at the gates and was never seen again. The accounts were always neat, the donations generous, the appearances flawless. Only the air around Wratham Hall felt wrong, tight and restless, as if the walls were holding back a secret that pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. An omniscient eye would see that the order to banish mirrors was not born from mercy but from fear, the kind of fear that knows a reflection may reveal a truth that the human eye chooses to deny. Mirrors do not flatter grief, nor do they conceal cruelty. They show the twitch of hunger behind a smile, the flicker of power disguised as care, the shadow of a hand lingering too long where it should not. When the last carriage of mirrors rattled away, the men who carried them whispered that the glass felt warm, as though it had held breath. They joked uneasily and then stopped, for behind the upper windows a figure stood perfectly still, a man whose eyes seemed immune to daylight. He raised his hand in what looked like thanks but felt like command. Below, the lady of the house watched with a face that did not move the way grief moves but rather the way something practiced holds still for inspection. The butler distributed coins along with reminders of respect. The coins were heavy, but the reminders heavier. That night the house felt smaller, as if it had folded in upon itself to better guard its own silence. From that day forward, Wratham Hall became a place where light refused to settle. Visitors woke in the night certain that someone had stood at their bedside and counted their breaths. A regular tapping traveled through the nursery walls, a sound like a spoon against glass, though no jars were ever found. The servants said nothing. The family spoke of charity and duty. And in the room where Clara had once brushed her hair, a blank wall stood where her mirror had been, covered with a cloth that shifted faintly when no wind moved. The house waited, holding its new secret with the patience of stone. The legend of the Farthingtons had only begun to breathe. The Farthington estate rose like a wounded monument, built of stone that seemed older than the soil it stood upon. Wratham Hall had once been called a beacon of modernity, a proud house of progress where industry's wealth spilled into art and gardens. Yet after 1901, when the mirrors were taken away, its appearance changed in ways that no architecture could explain. The great windows still looked upon rolling fields, the iron gates still opened to carriages with crests, but inside, light no longer behaved as it should. It moved unevenly, thick in some corners, thin in others, as though reflections had once carried brightness across the rooms and now, stripped of them, the air grew stagnant. A visitor stepping across the threshold felt as though he had stepped into an echo, into a place that remembered more than it revealed. The marble floors, once polished, now seemed to absorb footprints instead of shining them back, and the halls whispered with the faint sound of cloth draped where glass should have hung. The house had not been emptied of beauty, it had been emptied of truth. Portraits remained, though many were covered with velvet cloths that clung too tightly to the outlines beneath. Silverware remained, though dulled to a gray film that servants were ordered not to polish. Even the chandeliers were changed, crystals removed or darkened, so that no guest might catch the trembling of their own image in a shard of light. It was not simply that mirrors were gone. It was that reflection itself had been outlawed, as if the family feared not the sight of themselves, but the possibility that others might glimpse something hidden behind them. Guests felt it in their bones. A cough echoed longer than it should, a footstep rang as though chased by its own twin, and when eyes met across the dining table, there was always the uneasy question of who else might be watching from the places where light once rebounded. The servants obeyed without question. They lived by a code of silence that had grown heavier each year. A housemaid recalled that when she first began her service, she could see her own tired face in the grand hall mirror and whisper encouragement to herself in passing. After its removal, she said, she forgot the shape of her own features. She combed her hair by touch, painted her cheeks by memory, and over time, became uncertain if she was still herself. This was not neglect, it was policy. To forget one's reflection was to survive in Wratham Hall. The butler enforced it with quiet words and folded notes. Guests, too, were warned, do not bring personal mirrors, do not let polished metal catch too much light, do not tempt the silence of the house. Those who disobeyed were never openly punished, but they were never invited back. The house seemed to close around them like a throat around breath, expelling them quietly, leaving no trace of their visit in the conversations of those who remained. Outsiders speculated. Some claimed the family feared a curse, that mirrors trapped the souls of the dead, and Clara's restless spirit had stained every reflection with her drowning face. Others whispered that Lord Alistair had descended into madness, that he could not stand the sight of his aging skin. But those who knew him dismissed such claims, for in public he remained precise, well-dressed, his smile practiced and his voice measured. The real reason was never confessed aloud, but fragments of fear floated in the servant halls. They spoke of a night when a maid cleaning silver had screamed, saying she saw faces in the polished tray that did not belong to the living. They spoke of a footman who insisted that the grand mirror in the ballroom moved a fraction too late when he turned his head, as though the reflection had its own will. He told this to the steward and vanished within the week, his name never again mentioned by anyone connected to the house. The village carried these rumors with caution. Tradesmen said the house was cursed. Mothers told children not to stare too long at the waters near the estate, for they claimed the river itself had grown infected with reflection, carrying faces beneath the current. Yet commerce tied them to the Farthingtons, and fear kept them loyal. A mansion that bought their goods and built their schools could not be spoken against, not openly. So the story of the mirrorless house became a ghost tale told in barns and pubs, never in churches or courts. The official world turned a blind eye, while the hidden world of superstition knew something unnatural was being protected within those walls. What no outsider could know was that the house had become a vessel, reshaped into an instrument of control. By stripping away mirrors, the Farthingtons erased accountability. Without reflection, time felt unmeasured. Days and nights bled together. Servants worked until their hands cracked, never sure how pale or exhausted they looked, never aware of the toll carved into their skin. Guests lost track of their own expressions, unable to confirm if their smiles were genuine or strained. It was as if the house itself had swallowed identity whole. The Farthingtons stood untouched at the center of this void, perfect in appearance because nothing was allowed to contradict them. Their power thrived in silence, in absence, in the unseen. And so Wratham Hall earned its legend not through violence displayed, but through reflection denied. Every covered frame, every dulled candlestick, every blank surface became a reminder that something was being hidden, and perhaps it was not the family's grief at all, but the family's true face. To stand within its walls was to feel the weight of absence pressing upon the chest, to sense that the house itself carried eyes that did not belong to the living. By the end of that year, the estate was no longer a home. It was a stage where shadows played in place of reflections, and where every visitor left uncertain of what they had really seen. The tragedy of Clara's disappearance was remembered as the polite excuse, but those who had stepped inside the house of no mirrors whispered that her fate was only the beginning, that the true horror had been carefully hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. Lord Alistair Farthington was remembered by polite society as a gentleman of impeccable manners. He attended church on Sundays, signed checks for hospitals, and shook the hands of men who admired his industry. His reputation was the polished armor that made him untouchable. Yet beneath that civility, his hands told another story. They were not idle hands, not soft from wealth, but lean and restless, always in motion even when his face remained calm. He measured the world not in kindness but in precision, and every touch he laid upon his estate, his servants, and his so-called wards carried the weight of calculation. To most, he seemed attentive, a man who studied detail with a craftsman's eye. But to those who lived within his walls, his attention felt like a trap, as though the curve of a jaw or the length of a finger were not human traits but components of an experiment he had already begun. It was said that he collected time. He would sit in his study surrounded by clocks, grandfather clocks, carriage clocks, even small pocket watches, each one ticked at a slightly different rhythm, filling the room with a dissonant chorus. When a servant entered with a tray, he did not greet them with words but watched the way they breathed against the ticks, the way their pulse in their throat aligned or faltered with the shifting beats. He kept ledgers filled with notes, lines written in neat hand about the cadence of steps, the pauses in conversation, the irregularities in heartbeat. To him, people were not souls but instruments, flesh-bound devices that could be studied, timed, adjusted. He smiled often, but it was the smile of a man admiring a mechanism. Beneath that charm lay rituals that no outsider was meant to see. When a ward of the household fell ill, Alistair would insist on tending to them himself. He would place his hands upon their wrists, not with affection but with scrutiny, feeling the veins thrum beneath his touch as though testing the tautness of a string. He would murmur assurances, words that sounded like comfort, yet his eyes measured each flicker of pain with fascination. He kept journals of illness, not to heal but to catalog the exact stages by which life began to surrender. To him, suffering was not a curse but a lesson, and each lesson required its pupil. His hands became the tools of his private science. Where others might strike in anger or embrace in love, Alistair touched with ritualistic intent. He was known to trace patterns along the skin of the sick, geometric designs invisible to the eye but seared into his memory. Servants whispered that he pressed coins, heated until they burned, into the flesh of orphans to mark them with symbols no one else could read. When questioned, he would dismiss it as harmless discipline, a mark to remind them of obedience. Yet behind closed doors, those symbols grew complex, branching into circles and spirals that no human hand should have reason to create. His hands were always steady, never trembling, as though guided by something deeper than himself, something that whispered geometry and demanded flesh as canvas. The mask of normalcy never cracked in public. He donated to schools, praised the Queen, and signed his name with elegant loops of ink. But in the private halls of Wratham, children flinched when his shadow crossed the threshold, for his presence meant observation, and observation meant eventual use. They knew his footsteps by sound, the rhythm that slowed as he approached, the quiet pause outside a door before the handle turned. He was never hurried. He was deliberate, as though every action was written into a larger design only he could see. The dread was not in violence but in waiting, the knowledge that he would eventually call for them, and that once called, they would not return as they were. To the village, he was a man of taste and control. To the house, he was a surgeon of unseen wounds. His touch was not explosive, not brutal, but exacting, like a scalpel tracing invisible lines between innocence and destruction. Some servants claimed he could still his own heartbeat at will, holding silence in his chest until others around him grew anxious, as though their own hearts might stop in sympathy. Others swore that his hands could coax faint sounds from bone, pressing in certain places until the body produced a low moan, a tone he would then record in his ledgers as though it were music. Over time, even the walls of Wratham Hall bore the marks of his obsession. Scratches formed in patterns along the cellar stone, not from rats but from the pressure of his drawn instruments. Wood warped into subtle curves, as though guided by repeated hands pressing, shaping, insisting. What he could not achieve with blood, he achieved with persistence, bending matter itself to the symmetry of his vision. He was not content with wealth, nor with admiration. He sought control over the boundary between the seen and unseen, life and its shadow. His hands, smooth and unscarred, bore no evidence of the work they performed, for he carried out his rituals with such precision that no mark of guilt clung to his flesh. To the eye of society, Alistair Farthington was a gentleman who gave generously, a figure of respect. To the unseen eye, the one that lingers in silence and catches what others deny, he was something more terrifying, a man who had learned to hide a predator's hunger within the gestures of kindness. His hands were steady, his smile rehearsed, and behind them both lay the cold patience of a mind that did not simply kill, but studied, tested, and reshaped the meaning of cruelty into ritual. Wratham Hall, already stripped of its reflections, now carried the imprint of its master's will, a place where every touch was measured, every breath recorded, every life a pattern to be broken apart and studied in silence. Beneath Wratham Hall, below the wine cellars and the servant quarters, lay a passage few ever entered willingly. It was narrow, carved of stone that seemed damp even in summer, a corridor that bent downward until air itself grew heavy, stale with old breath. At the end of this descent stood a locked door of iron, marked not with a name but with grooves that looked almost accidental, as if the stone around the frame had been clawed by hands desperate to escape. The household never spoke of what lay beyond. They only knew that when the door opened, the air that escaped carried with it a soundless pressure, the echo of agony without words. It was here that Lord Alistair kept his most prized creation, the chamber he called his library, though nothing within it could be read in ink. Inside stood rows of strange devices, machines of wood and brass shaped not for labor but for listening. Each was rigged with coils, pipes, and fragile cylinders of wax. To an unknowing eye, they resembled phonographs or scientific curiosities, inventions one might expect from a man fascinated by industry. Yet to those who had seen them used, they were something else entirely, instruments designed to preserve the last sound of human suffering. When a victim was brought into the chamber, bound and trembling, Alistair did not rush to violence. He placed them before one of his machines, adjusted the needle, and waited. The chamber was not built for torture in the common sense of pain inflicted, it was built to harvest sound, to capture the precise pitch of a scream as life fractured into death. The methods he used were cruel not because they were wild but because they were deliberate. He experimented with ways to draw the deepest, most resonant cries from his victims, as if seeking notes in a scale only he could hear. Sometimes he would immerse a hand in ice water until the bones locked with pain, watching the voice climb into a sharp, high register. Other times he applied heat in gradual increments, listening as the cry wavered between gasps and groans. He learned the effects of hunger, of darkness, of hope promised and then removed. Each variation produced a sound, and each sound he catalogued with meticulous care, etching numbers into the walls beside the wax cylinders that stored them. To him, these screams were not wasted air but artifacts, voices turned into objects that could be replayed, studied, compared. The chamber became a library of despair. On its shelves rested hundreds of labeled cylinders, each one a coffin for a single scream. Servants who stumbled upon the room by accident said the machines seemed to whisper when unprovoked, faint echoes leaking from their grooves, as though the suffering they had captured still vibrated in the air. Alistair would sit for hours in the darkness, replaying the recordings, tilting his head with the care of a musician tuning an orchestra. He was not moved to pity. He was moved to fascination, as though each sound revealed a secret chord of the human soul. Where others heard terror, he heard music. Where others recoiled, he leaned closer, tracing patterns in the air with his fingers as though conducting an invisible symphony of agony. What made his cruelty unbearable was the order in which he preserved it. He numbered the screams as though cataloging a collection, each one carefully marked by date, by method, by the condition of the victim before the sound was produced. He referred to them in his journals not as people but as tones, assigning language to their voices as if they were instruments. The stable boy became tone 47. Clara, the missing ward, became tone 61. Their names were erased, replaced by numbers, their humanity converted into data. In this way, the chamber reduced human suffering into a sequence of files, as sterile as an archive yet as horrifying as a graveyard without bodies. The servants whispered that the chamber had no end, that each scream layered upon the last until the stone itself carried vibrations that could never be erased. Some claim that if you stood long enough in the darkness, the air pressed against your ears and forced you to hear the voices, not faint but immediate, as if the dead themselves had returned to perform their own torment. It was not imagination. The machines leaked sound when the wax warped in the damp. The cries blended until it was impossible to tell one voice from another, creating a low wailing hum that seemed to bleed from the walls. The chamber was alive with echoes of agony, sustained not by flesh but by memory. Lord Alistair called it his triumph. He believed he had created a new form of history, one not written in books but carved into sound, where the essence of fear could be preserved long after the body decayed. He imagined a future where scholars might study his recordings, where the architecture of pain could be mapped as clearly as the stars. His journals spoke of building a cathedral of sound, a place where the cries of the dying would rise together into a harmony so perfect it would transcend human meaning. To him, cruelty was not a crime, it was progress, the pursuit of a music that required death as its only instrument. And so the chamber grew, scream by scream, until it became the hidden heart of Wratham Hall. Above, the family entertained guests, dined beneath chandeliers, spoke of charity and grace. Below, the numbered cylinders multiplied, each one a frozen moment of horror, a life reduced to sound. Those who knew of the chamber carried the knowledge like a disease, eating at their silence, warping their sleep. For to live in Wratham was to live above a graveyard of voices, to walk each day knowing that beneath your feet, despair had been harvested and preserved, not by accident but by design. The chamber of numbered screams was not only the record of Lord Alistair's cruelty. It was the proof of his obsession, the evidence that suffering to him was not random but ritual, not senseless but sacred. And as his collection grew, so too did his confidence, for each scream preserved in wax was a reminder that life could be dismantled, recorded, replayed, and forgotten, all without consequence. What began with the disappearance of a girl had now become a library of terror, waiting in silence, waiting for more. Lord Alistair's cruelty did not end with the harvesting of sound. The chamber below the house was only the beginning of his ritual. What he sought was permanence, something beyond the fragile vibrations of a scream that could fade in wax or stone. He wanted to mark the body itself, to leave designs upon flesh that would remain long after the voice was gone. For him, pain was not random but symbolic, and every victim became a canvas upon which he traced patterns of devotion. In public he spoke of duty, of progress, of science, but in the secrecy of his halls he practiced a private liturgy, one where cruelty became scripture. He worked with a precision that betrayed patience more than passion. His hands were steady, his tools clean. He used fine needles, heated irons, sharpened bone instruments filed smooth by his own making. Victims were prepared with silence first. He would stitch their lips into permanent smiles, the thread black against pale skin, pulling the face into an expression of joy even as the body writhed beneath it. The act was not done for cruelty alone, it was symbolic, a ritual to bind truth beneath performance. To him, suffering hidden behind a smile was the purest expression of human life, the mask that all society wore but which he alone revealed through force. Once silenced, the body became a map. He pressed mercury into the eyes, not to kill immediately but to cloud the gaze until it shimmered like liquid mirrors. He believed the eyes held secrets, reflections that might expose him, so he drowned them in silver to erase their witness. Victims wept tears of poison until their sockets burned, yet he watched with fascination, as though noting the way truth itself was erased in liquid shimmer. He kept jars of mercury-stained cloth in his study, trophies not of conquest but of ritual cleansing, proof that no eye had seen him as he truly was. The skin became his final scripture. He branded clockwork designs into their flesh, geometric circles with teeth and spokes, symbols that mimicked the gears of his clocks upstairs. Each pattern was unique, but all followed the rhythm of machinery. He spoke in his journals of binding humanity to time, of marking the flesh so that the body would no longer belong to itself but to the rhythm he commanded. Servants who found the discarded remains whispered of backs scorched with symbols that seemed to move when lit by firelight, twisting into illusions of turning wheels, as though the body itself had been transformed into a machine. These marks were not scars of cruelty, they were the handwriting of a man who believed he was building a new order, where the human form was reduced to parts, and pain was the ink of his design. There were other rituals, less visible but no less grotesque. He demanded silence during the process, a silence enforced not only by the sewing of lips but by his own control of the chamber. He worked in darkness, lit only by a single lantern, and forbade even the faintest murmur of prayer. If the victim tried to hum or moan, he pressed his hand upon their throat until air stopped, not to kill but to remind them that silence was the foundation of obedience. He called it stillness, and in his notes he wrote that true order could only emerge when the noise of individuality was extinguished. To outsiders, the family projected an image of composure, of refinement. They hosted dinners, funded charities, smiled for portraits. But within the walls of Wratham Hall, each ritual carved deeper into its foundations. The servants began to notice that the silence of the house grew heavier after each ceremony, as though the air itself remembered what had been done and refused to let sound linger. Whispers died in the halls, footsteps faded too quickly, even laughter from the children of guests seemed muffled before it reached the ceiling. The house itself became complicit, absorbing the silence Alistair demanded until every corner of it breathed with restraint. What made his cruelty unbearable was the logic behind it. He did not see himself as a murderer but as a keeper of truth. He believed society was a mask of politeness stretched across a chaos of hunger, and that by forcing bodies into his rituals he was unveiling the true face of humanity. He convinced himself that smiles stitched upon agony revealed honesty, that eyes drowned in silver could no longer lie, that skin marked with gears proved man's submission to the machine of time. His victims became symbols in a theology only he understood, a scripture of flesh written in silence, preserved not for others but for himself. By the time rumors spread in the village of orphans disappearing, of servants leaving without farewell, the rituals had already consumed dozens of lives. But no one spoke against him, for the Farthingtons remained generous in their gifts, and society preferred the comfort of appearances to the horror of truth. And so the rituals continued, deepening their hold upon the house, until even silence itself seemed to scream. The Farthingtons were masters of appearances. For every whisper of unease that clung to Wratham Hall, there was always a counterweight of charity, a spectacle that reminded society of their elegance and grace. Twice a year, they hosted gatherings so lavish that no guest could afford to decline an invitation. These nights were dressed in music, perfume, and candlelight, with tables heavy from silver dishes, wine imported from France, and roasted meats that glistened under the chandelier's glow. The villagers spoke of these feasts as proof of the family's refinement, the mark of a household that gave back to its community. Yet beneath the polished oak floors and velvet curtains, another feast unfolded, one hidden from polite eyes, and it was there that Lord Alistair's appetite truly revealed itself. The upper rooms brimmed with laughter as aristocrats toasted to progress, their glasses raised above tablecloths of embroidered silk. But deep below, In the sealed chambers of the house, servants and wards were not permitted to join in celebration. Instead, they were taken into narrow rooms where the air grew unnaturally cold, as though the stone itself rejected warmth. It was here that Alistair orchestrated his most grotesque ritual, a ritual that had nothing to do with food but everything to do with consumption. He had designed a series of chambers fitted with brass pipes and glass vessels, a machinery that drew in the exhaled breath of those locked within. Victims were kept alive long enough to struggle, their lungs working against panic, each desperate breath pulled into the system through valves that hissed like serpents. The air they gave, thick with terror, was trapped in delicate glass bottles sealed with wax. To an observer, the jars seemed filled with nothing, yet when the lantern light struck them, faint swirls of vapor twisted inside, a breath turned into visible fog. Alistair called it the harvest of innocence, convinced that the final breath of the unwilling carried a purity stronger than any wine. He stored the bottles in cabinets, labeled with names and dates, and during the feasts above he would bring a chosen few to the table. Hidden in crystal decanters, the vapor was released into the air, a subtle draft that drifted among the guests. No one knew what they inhaled as they laughed and ate, but Alistair watched them closely, savoring the way their eyes brightened, their skin warmed, their joy deepened with every invisible sip of stolen breath. To him, it was communion. He believed he was binding the upper world to the lower, blending the lives of the powerful with the last moments of the powerless. Each laugh, each careless toast, was seasoned by the agony below. It was not food that sustained his feast but the unseen presence of suffering disguised as merriment. In his journals, he wrote that the rich dined on the essence of the poor, and by consuming what was harvested, they became complicit in a ritual of renewal. His cruelty lay not only in the act of taking but in the deception, the way he transformed death into an ingredient, folded neatly into the performance of generosity. The servants who carried trays in the ballroom sometimes shivered without knowing why. The air felt heavier on feast nights, as though an invisible crowd pressed against the walls, unseen but present. Those who worked in the lower chambers understood too well. They whispered that the fog bottles wept when uncorked, a faint condensation running down their glass as if tears slid along their sides. They said the guests above never noticed, too drunk on luxury to feel the weight of breath that did not belong to them filling their lungs. The servants noticed, though, and they feared, for each time a bottle was opened, the silence of the house deepened, as though another layer of innocence had been stripped away. No guest ever questioned the Farthingtons' success. They saw only wealth, hospitality, refinement. They left the feasts speaking of generosity, praising the family for their commitment to community. None asked why the servants' faces looked pale, why the children kept in the household grew thinner with each passing year, why the air near the estate's gates seemed colder the morning after. The horror of the feast was hidden beneath politeness, protected by the refusal to see. What made these nights most unbearable was the ritual's logic. Alistair believed that innocence, once consumed, transformed power. He convinced himself that the breath of the weak gave vitality to the strong, that by breathing in their despair the wealthy could cleanse themselves of their own guilt. It was not gluttony, it was doctrine, a theology disguised as hospitality. Each feast was an altar, each toast a prayer, each stolen breath a sacrifice disguised as celebration. And so the house thrived on contradiction. Above, violins played and wine poured freely, filling rooms with music and light. Below, silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of pipes and the faint rattle of lungs giving away their last. Both worlds existed in the same house, joined by brass tubes and invisible vapors, woven together into a single performance that left no mark on the polished surface of the family's reputation. The guests left with full stomachs and flushed cheeks, never knowing that their joy was stolen, never imagining that the innocence of the vanished had passed through their bodies like air. By the time the candles were extinguished and the last carriage rolled away, Alistair would return to the lower chambers. He walked among the rows of bottles, tracing the wax seals with his fingers as though touching the lips of those he had silenced. He smiled at the neat rows of labeled glass, satisfied that his feast had once again bound the living to the dying. To him, this was not crime but order, not horror but harmony. Wratham Hall remained spotless, its reputation untarnished, while beneath its foundations innocence was harvested, bottled, and consumed, until even the air itself seemed too heavy to breathe. The children arrived at Wratham Hall with little fanfare. Some came from distant orphanages under the guise of patronage, others from desperate parents who believed the Farthingtons' wealth promised security. To the world, these children were the lucky few, granted a life inside a household of refinement. But inside the mirrorless halls, luck turned into silence. They were stripped first of their names. Lord Alistair insisted that wards should not carry the burden of individuality. He called them by numbers, written neatly into ledgers beside dates of arrival. Their old names vanished, swallowed by the estate as though never spoken at all. At first, the children believed they were to be servants, trained in discipline and obedience. They swept floors, polished brass, tended gardens. Yet the rules were stranger than labor required. They were forbidden to ask for mirrors, forbidden to speak above whispers, forbidden to call each other by anything but numbers. They ate in silence, they slept in silence, and when they laughed, a servant's hand pressed against their mouths to hush the sound. Over time, their identities withered. To live nameless was to live half-erased, and soon they began to forget who they once were. Some never lasted long. A child who misstepped, who coughed at the wrong time, who dared to utter their lost name in the night, would be summoned to the lower chambers. They left with frightened eyes, clutching the hands of those who promised it would be brief. None returned as they had been. Sometimes, days later, a child's small shoe or ribbon was found on a servant's cart, marked with stains no washing could remove. Other times, nothing at all was left, only the thick silence of the house deepening after their absence. The wards learned not to ask. To ask was to be chosen next. The rituals inflicted upon them were among the most grotesque. Lord Alistair treated children not as pupils to be raised but as materials to be reshaped. He had a fascination with smallness, with the fragility of developing bones and the purity of voices not yet broken. In his chamber, he bound tiny skeletons together with wires, shaping them into dolls that stared with glass eyes plucked from jars where mercury still shimmered faintly. Their spines were curved into grotesque poses, their finger bones sewn into patterns that mimicked lace. The dolls sat in cabinets dressed with ribbons, admired as art pieces by their maker. To him, they were not trophies but symbols, the proof that innocence could be broken down and reconstructed into obedience. The servants who cleaned the chamber swore the dolls moved when no one watched, their glass eyes shifting slightly as if following the flicker of light. Some whispered that the faint sound of children weeping drifted from the cabinets at night, soft and muffled, as though the bones themselves still remembered. Others claimed the dolls sometimes appeared in different positions, arms raised or heads tilted, despite the locks on their cases. The wards who survived the halls avoided the cabinets entirely, keeping their eyes on the floor whenever they were brought near. They understood what those figures meant. They understood that they were not safe. To the outside world, none of this existed. Families who entrusted their children to the Farthingtons were told their wards had been educated, employed, or relocated to other estates. Letters were forged, written in careful imitation of childish hands, assuring distant relatives that all was well. No one questioned the inconsistencies. The Farthingtons' name carried too much weight, their donations too many, their reputation too carefully guarded. And so the children disappeared quietly, their names erased, their memories turned into objects locked behind glass. What made this cruelty unbearable was not only the violence but the philosophy behind it. Alistair believed children were the purest vessels of silence, unformed enough to be molded, empty enough to hold his rituals without resistance. He stripped them of their names because he believed names gave strength, and by denying them identity, he made them malleable. He stitched their smiles because he believed laughter without consent was the only true joy. He turned their bodies into dolls because he believed innocence had no value until broken and rebuilt by his own hands. To him, this was not horror but creation, a work of art made from silence and bone. By the time villagers whispered of orphans vanishing, the children within Wratham Hall had already ceased to exist in the way the world understood existence. They were no longer boys or girls. They were numbers, smiles sewn in place, voices taken, bones reassembled into grotesque reflections of life. They were the children without names, living proof of a cruelty that erased humanity with meticulous care. And yet society saw only the surface, the feasts, the donations, the elegance of a family untouched by scandal. The children's fate was hidden in silence, locked in cabinets, remembered only by the creak of glass eyes staring in the dark. The village of Wratham lived in the shadow of the hall. Its people tilled the Farthingtons' fields, delivered their goods, and bowed their heads when carriages passed along the narrow lanes. For generations, the family had been their patrons, providing work in the mills and alms for the poor. Outwardly, there was gratitude. But beneath the surface, gratitude rotted into fear. By 1901, the villagers no longer saw Wratham Hall as a place of grandeur but as a looming mouth that swallowed children and secrets, leaving behind only silence. It began with disappearances no one dared name. A farmhand's daughter sent to the hall for service never returned. A boy who delivered milk was said to have run away, though his bicycle was found leaning against the gates. The vicar's niece, sent to live as a ward, was spoken of once at Sunday service and never again. In every case, the family offered polite explanations, relocation, opportunity, misadventure, and the villagers nodded, unwilling to question. They told themselves it was not their place to pry. They told themselves the Farthingtons had power enough to protect or to destroy, and survival required silence. Silence soon became the law of the village. In the tavern, men lowered their voices if the hall was mentioned, casting nervous glances toward the door. Mothers hushed their children when they played too close to the estate's edge, whispering old warnings about spirits in the woods, as if ghosts were safer to believe in than truth. Farmers who delivered grain left their carts at the gate, refusing to cross the threshold. They spoke of the strange feeling that gripped them whenever they approached the mansion, the way their breath shortened, the way light seemed to falter against the windows. Yet they delivered all the same, for the hall paid well, and coin was stronger than courage. The village doctor knew more than most. He saw the bodies that returned, not many, but enough to know something was wrong. A servant once brought him a boy with burns across his skin in patterns too deliberate to be accident. The doctor treated the wounds in silence, and when the butler arrived with payment, he accepted without question. Later, he told his wife they must never speak of it again. The money was enough to replace their roof before winter, and the boy himself was never seen afterward. Each villager carried a version of this compromise, a bargain struck between survival and conscience. Over time, silence shaped the entire community. The cobbler fixed shoes left at the gate but never asked why they were stained. The blacksmith mended locks delivered by carriage, noticing they were heavy and cruel, but said nothing as he hammered them back into strength. Even the church bells seemed muted, their chimes swallowed by the unease that thickened the air. The village became complicit not by choice but by surrender, each person turning their gaze away, hoping someone else might act, knowing no one ever would. Children grew up with warnings rather than explanations. They were told not to look too long into puddles near the estate, for reflections could pull them inside. They were told to leave offerings of bread at crossroads on feast nights, so that whatever passed through the village on its way to the hall would not stop at their door. These stories spread like folklore, disguising truth as superstition, keeping fear alive but unspoken. It was easier to believe in curses than in human cruelty, easier to blame shadows than to accuse the wealthy family whose coin fed their homes. What made the silence unbearable was the weight it carried. Every villager knew, in some corner of their heart, that they were witnesses. Each missing child, each vanished servant, each unnatural chill that spread through the fields was a warning they chose to ignore. They lived with the knowledge that innocence was being consumed above them, and yet they went on with their work, their marriages, their harvests, as though nothing was wrong. In truth, the Farthingtons' evil did not thrive only in their mansion. It thrived in the silence that surrounded it, in the refusal of a village to speak, in the complicity of ordinary people who feared truth more than lies. By 1901, Wratham was no longer a village of neighbors but a village of watchers. Everyone watched the hall from the corners of their eyes, everyone watched each other to ensure silence was kept, and no one spoke aloud of what they knew. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the fields bent low as though bowing not to the family but to the weight of secrets. And so the Farthingtons' cruelty was allowed to flourish, not hidden by distance but by proximity, not denied by ignorance but by choice. The silence of the village was not absence of sound, it was the sound of evil protected by fear. For years, the absence of mirrors in Wratham Hall was spoken of as eccentricity, a quirk explained by grief, superstition, or vanity. Guests who noticed the covered frames or the stripped walls rarely pressed the question. To speak of it was to risk being unwelcome, and so they accepted the strangeness as one more curiosity of a wealthy family. Yet behind the silence lay a truth more disturbing than any rumor: the mirrors had not been removed to protect the living, but to prevent the dead from showing themselves. Lord Alistair understood this better than anyone, for he had seen what others refused to believe. The revelation began not with a scream, but with a reflection. Servants whispered of nights when glass surfaces shimmered with faces not present in the room. A girl polishing a decanter swore she saw her missing brother's eyes staring back at her, wide with terror, even though she knew he had been taken to the lower chambers weeks before. A maid said she glimpsed Clara, the ward declared drowned, her mouth sewn into a smile, pressed against the dark surface of a window though no one stood outside. These sightings were brief, vanishing the moment the surface was disturbed, but they repeated with such persistence that even the boldest servants refused to carry polished trays or water jugs into the dining hall. Alistair himself encountered the truth in the great ballroom mirror, a towering sheet of glass once admired for its flawless reflection. He had walked past it after one of his rituals, his hands still trembling with satisfaction, when he saw not his own image but the distorted faces of those he had silenced. They were crowded behind his reflection, mouths open in eternal cries, eyes wide with accusation. His own smile stretched across their faces, stitched into them like a mask. The vision did not vanish when he blinked. The faces moved a fraction out of sync with his body, delayed as though replaying his gestures with unbearable weight. In that moment, he understood that the mirrors no longer belonged to him. They had become windows into a truth he could not contain. From that night, his obsession turned to erasure. Every mirror was stripped from the house, every polished surface dulled, every chance for reflection suffocated beneath cloth or shadow. He told his family and servants that mirrors were dangerous to the soul, that they invited curses, but in truth he feared what they revealed, not as vanity, not as grief, but as guilt. The mirrors did not lie. They showed the faces of the lost, bound forever in the shape of his cruelty, screaming through the veneer of his politeness. They had become his true audience, a choir of the condemned trapped behind glass, replaying his rituals in silence for any who dared to look. The absence of mirrors brought no peace. Instead, it deepened the unease of the household. Without reflections, the walls seemed to close in, the rooms grew dim, and the air pressed heavily on those who remained. Yet even with the glass removed, the victims lingered. Servants whispered that they could see faint impressions in the sheen of spilled water, or in the dark gloss of their own eyes when they closed them too slowly. Some said the faces of the lost had attached themselves not only to mirrors but to memory, staining every surface that could once return a likeness. The house had become a mirror itself, its silence reflecting the screams buried beneath its floors. What made this revelation unbearable was the way it exposed the truth Alistair tried to deny. The cruelty he practiced in secrecy could not be hidden forever, for the human soul leaves traces not only in memory but in matter. The mirrors had recorded what was done before them, not in wax cylinders or ledgers but in images, living impressions that replayed his crimes without mercy. They were archives of despair, proof that the dead cannot be silenced, no matter how carefully their names are erased. And in destroying them, Alistair revealed his greatest fear, not discovery by the world, but discovery by himself. He could not bear to see what he truly was when stripped of charm, wealth, and control. He could not bear to face the reflection of evil smiling back at him through the faces of the innocent. The village noticed the change, though they never named it aloud. They said the hall grew darker after 1901, its windows absorbing light rather than shining it. Guests who once admired the ballroom left uneasy, claiming they felt watched though no mirrors remained. Even children in the village spoke of glimpsing pale faces in puddles near the estate, faces that rippled and vanished when they bent to touch the water. Silence deepened, and with it, complicity. The truth of the mirrors was spoken only in whispers, traded in corners, wrapped in superstition to disguise its horror. And so the house remained mirrorless, not out of grief, nor superstition, nor madness, but out of fear of reflection. For the Farthingtons, to see themselves was to confront the truth they had buried beneath ritual and silence. For those who knew, it was a reminder that evil does not vanish when hidden. It lingers, pressed against the surface of the world, waiting for the smallest shimmer of glass to return. The end of Wratham Hall came not with confession, nor with trial, but with fire. In the autumn of 1901, smoke was seen curling above the estate's towers, thick and black against the pale sky. Villagers rushed to the fields, staring from a distance as the mansion glowed red in the dusk, its windows pulsing like eyes. Some claimed the fire began in the kitchens, others whispered of servants setting flame to cloth-covered frames, hoping to purge the house of its silence. But the truth of its origin was never known, for the fire moved too quickly, as though the house itself longed to devour its own secrets. Within hours, Wratham Hall was reduced to a skeleton of stone, its insides collapsed into ash. Those who watched swore they heard something more than wood crackling. They spoke of shrieks rising with the smoke, cries not carried by any living throat but by the house itself. Some said the fire released the voices bottled in the chambers below, the screams Alistair had numbered spilling into the night in one final chorus. Others believed the faces trapped in mirrors had escaped in the blaze, their distorted mouths stretching in the smoke, their eyes shining like sparks. Witnesses described shapes writhing above the flames, silhouettes of children with sewn smiles and servants with stitched throats, all dissolving into the air as quickly as they formed. The villagers trembled, torn between terror and relief, certain they were seeing the house's crimes consumed at last. When the fire subsided, the ruins smoldered for days. Stone chimneys jutted into the sky like broken teeth, blackened walls leaned inward as if ashamed of standing. Among the ashes, fragments were discovered that unsettled even the hardened. Melted glass lay pooled in grotesque forms, hardened into faces twisted mid-scream. They were not mirrors in any ordinary sense, no frame, no silvering, but lumps of molten reflection, shaped as though the fire itself had revealed the truth the house had tried to hide. Servants who sifted through the ruins refused to touch them, crossing themselves before walking away. The faces remained embedded in the stone until weather eroded them into nothing. Lord Alistair was never seen again. Some claimed he perished in the blaze, his body burned beyond recognition, his rituals consumed by the fire he had courted. Others whispered he escaped, vanishing into the night to rebuild elsewhere, his hands unmarked, his smile intact. No body was recovered, and no grave was dug. The family's name was spoken in cautious tones for a few years, then left to history's margins. To the world, Wratham Hall was simply another estate lost to misfortune, a reminder of wealth too proud to survive. To those who knew, it was a tomb without walls, its destruction an act of justice no court could deliver. The villagers carried on, though never quite the same. They rebuilt their lives on silence, refusing to speak of what they had seen. They told their children only that the hall had burned for its sins, though they never named the sins aloud. Fields grew again, houses thrived, yet the land near the ruins remained barren, its soil blackened, its air unnaturally cold. Travelers who passed claimed they felt watched, as though faces still lingered in the smoke that drifted across the hills. Some even claimed to hear faint sounds on the wind, long, drawn-out wails that dissolved before reaching the ear fully, as though numbered screams had scattered and attached themselves to the landscape forever. What made the collapse of the house most haunting was its ambiguity. Fire consumes without testimony, erasing detail, leaving only fragments that cannot prove or deny. The destruction silenced the evidence, but it also prevented truth from ever being spoken aloud. Records were lost, victims uncounted, crimes unpunished. The family's wealth ensured that newspapers reported the event as accident, not tragedy. Officially, the Farthingtons died as patrons, not predators. Unofficially, their legacy remained locked in whispers, remembered only in fragments of molten glass and in the silence of a village that had chosen not to act. And so Wratham Hall's collapse was both an ending and a continuation. The house fell, but its memory spread like ash in the wind, staining those who had known and done nothing. The fire was not cleansing, it was concealment. Evil had been contained in stone, and once stone was gone, it seeped outward, unbound, invisible, yet always present. The hall no longer stood, but its weight pressed on every field, every cottage, every dream in Wratham. Its silence had survived the fire, just as silence had allowed it to live for so long. After the fire, the world was quick to turn its gaze away from Wratham Hall. Newspapers wrote only a few polite lines, mourning the loss of a distinguished family home, praising the Farthingtons' contributions to industry and charity. No mention was made of the vanished wards, no acknowledgement of servants who never returned. In print, the family died with dignity. But in the shadows of record halls and locked cabinets, a different story began to gather. Officials who had long looked the other way could no longer ignore the trail of disappearances tied to the estate. Clerks whispered of papers quietly removed from orphanages, ledgers rewritten, whole names struck from registers as if they had never existed. The work was not to expose the truth, but to bury it deeper, to control it before whispers grew into scandal. Yet even silence leaves residue. Inquiries into orphanages grew stricter in the years that followed. Inspectors arrived unannounced, demanding to see the children, to verify their names, to confirm their numbers matched their records. Laws shifted quietly, requiring signatures, witness accounts, oversight where before there had been none. Few admitted why these changes came so suddenly, but those who studied the files later saw the pattern. 1901, the year Wratham Hall burned, became the turning point. The Farthingtons' crimes were never spoken of openly, yet their shadow rewrote the rules of care. Entire systems changed, not because of justice, but because of fear. The legacy also left its mark on servants' rights. Reports emerged of abuses in other estates, stories that might once have been ignored but were now investigated with greater urgency. Parliament spoke of dignity in labor, of protecting those too poor to protect themselves. The reforms were framed as progress, a step forward for society, yet beneath the polished speeches lay the unspoken truth. The silence that had allowed the Farthingtons' cruelty to thrive could not be allowed to repeat so openly again. It was not compassion that drove change but horror, in the determination that such horror remain unnamed. Among the villagers, memory lived differently. They avoided the ruins, built no memorial, left no marker of what had been done. Yet they carried the knowledge in their bones. Families who had lost children never spoke of them again, yet at night their absence haunted the cottages, the lullabies, the empty chairs. For decades, no one dared utter the name Farthington aloud in church, as if even in prayer the truth might spread. Their silence became its own ritual, passed to new generations without explanation, only with warnings: do not look too long into dark windows, do not trust a smile too easily given, do not forget that even the wealthy can be monstrous. Archivists in London uncovered fragments years later, scattered testimonies and unsigned confessions. A servant's diary, pages torn but intact enough to describe stitched smiles and bottled breath. A letter from a clerk in the orphanage, begging a superior to investigate why so many children sent to the hall were never heard from again. These records were not published but sealed, placed in boxes marked confidential, to be forgotten in basements of state offices. When they were finally unsealed long after, scholars read them with disbelief. The Farthingtons had lived as ghosts in official history, their cruelty erased, their reputation preserved, their crimes allowed to fester in silence. Only in these papers, dusty and hidden, did their true legacy emerge. What made the legacy unbearable was its half-life. The Farthingtons were both destroyed and protected. Their house was ashes, their rituals ended, yet their reputation was never publicly shattered. They were remembered as patrons, their names carved into hospital wings, their donations praised in plaques. No inscription told of children without names, of screams numbered and catalogued, of innocence bottled like fine wine. Society had changed in response to them, but society had also protected them, burying their story beneath reforms while never daring to confront it openly. The Farthingtons had vanished, but the silence that allowed them to thrive survived. By the middle of the century, when people spoke of Wratham at all, it was as legend, a ghost story told to frighten children. Few believed it, fewer admitted to knowing. But in locked archives, in quiet reforms, in the shifting laws of orphanages and servants' protections, their shadow endured. Their true memorial was not stone nor plaque but silence, an absence in history where their victims should have been named. And in that silence, the Farthingtons' legacy lived on, unspoken but undeniable. Evil does not always announce itself with violence in the streets or blood upon the floor. Sometimes it wears silence, dressed in wealth, cloaked in manners, smiling as it moves among the unsuspecting. The Farthingtons understood this truth better than most. Their cruelty was never meant for spectacle. It thrived precisely because it was hidden, folded into charity, concealed behind the polished armor of reputation. For years, the village saw only the generosity, the donations, the grand feasts. They did not see, or did not wish to see, that beneath the silk and velvet was a hunger that turned people into instruments, into dolls, into numbers scratched into stone. The hall had burned, the family vanished, but what they embodied did not die with them. Silence had been their true accomplice, and silence is eternal. It was silence that kept the villagers obedient, silence that made the newspapers print only half-truths, silence that convinced lawmakers to reform without revealing why. It was silence that allowed the victims to vanish without graves, without names, without prayers. The fire consumed the evidence, but silence consumed the memory, and in some ways, that was more devastating. A scream is terrible, but it ends. Silence endures. When scholars unearthed the sealed documents, when archivists read the diaries and ledgers left behind, they spoke of the weight that pressed from the pages. These were not just records of cruelty but reflections of complicity, proof that evil does not live alone, but survives through those who look away. The Farthingtons had perfected the art of blending into society, hiding atrocity within politeness. Their story became more than one family's corruption. It became a mirror, forcing us to ask how many other houses, other villages, other institutions were the same smile even now, feeding on silence as surely as Wratham Hall once did. The legacy of the Farthingtons was not only in the laws quietly changed, not only in the reforms whispered into existence. It was in the lesson that cruelty thrives when unspoken, when polite society refuses to look too closely at what hides beneath the surface. They had proven that evil can exist in broad daylight, so long as it is wrapped in charity and sealed by silence. Their estate collapsed, but their method survived, because it was never bricks and mortar that sustained them. It was people's refusal to speak. What makes their story unbearable is not the rituals themselves, grotesque as they were. It is the knowledge that they were allowed to happen at all. That children vanished and were not named. That servants disappeared and were not mourned. That the village watched and said nothing. That society praised while privately suspecting. Evil wore silence then, and it wears silence now, waiting for us to ignore what we do not wish to see. The Farthingtons may have been consumed by fire, but the silence that nourished them lingers everywhere unchallenged cruelty thrives. And so the story ends not in justice, nor in peace, but in reflection. Reflection not in glass, for all mirrors were shattered, but in memory, in conscience, in the uncomfortable truth that silence is as dangerous as the act itself. The victims of Wratham Hall are not remembered in plaques or prayers. They are remembered only in the weight of silence that followed, the laws that changed without explanation, the rumors passed from parent to child. They remain a question more than a memory, a reminder that evil does not vanish when we bury it. It waits. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could silence still hide such horrors in our own time, dressed in wealth, concealed in reputation, waiting for no one to speak?